What did you like about George Orwell?
Well, again, not to sound too conventional about it, I think he really would follow logic and honesty to their full conclusion. I mean, he would not be deflected by the fact that this might offend someone he knew or some cause with which he was associated, or more important, I mean, wouldn't even discompose himself. In other words, he thought, okay, if I don't like this conclusion, I'm still sticking with it if it's been arrived at honorably. It sounds like an easy thing to do or to say, but it's actually very hard to live by, and I think he really did live by it. I thought he put up a good show for the left in his life at a time when it was in great difficulty, because people were pressed very hard to say, look, if you're on the left, you must support the Soviet Union because it's endangered and it's encircled by fascism, so on, and you mustn't criticize it in public even if you have your doubts. And he said, no, that would be stupid. That would be giving up the thing that makes me a radical in the first place, which is the right to think for myself. That was a lot harder to do now than it sounds, again. And then I think he was a very witty and brilliant stylist. I think his writings on other authors like Dickens, for example, his reflections on eternal subjects like capital punishment, for example, or family life, ordinary things, arguments that never go away, always worth rereading.
When did you come to the United States?
One of the most poignant publishing phenomena of the last several years was the 70-month presence on the bestseller list of William Bennett's The Book of Virtues. Who was buying that 3-pound doorstop? Not kids. Clearly its purchasers were adults, many of them baby boomers, who bought it to read to their kids. You weren't, yet they also reading it for themselves, and he now has the Moral Compass, another sequel, and a Moral Compass for kids, and bring that subject up for both of you. What's the fascination, do you think, with the Book of Virtues?
I just had to review the Book of Virtues for the Times Literary Supplement. I had no idea till I was paid to read it how bad it is.
Why is it bad?
How shallow and boring and how poorly selected and how pompous. For example, there's just, in a Book of Virtues for American children, there's, I think, one page from the whole of Mark Twain, and it's the boring bit where Tom Sawyer whitewashes the fence. And yet there's about 8 pages from one of the Watergate burglars about how he found God, or one of the Watergate burglars who did find God. It's absolute pabulum, I think. I don't believe anyone has really read it unless they've, like me, been paid to do so. I'm sure it's been bought with the best of intentions, but it's a huge disappointment.
Mr. Brookhiser?
Well, the thing is...
I've just realized it's a Hogwarts dining room that we're in. I knew it would come to me in a second. with pandas. And hard by Jefferson Street? No, this one here is Jefferson Way, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. There are now, I realize, there are 3 roads or streets in Washington, D.C. named for Jefferson. I think he's the only one of whom that can be said, and it's probably just as well because I now know there were at least 3 of him. But it's telling that there should be as many as that. I was always rather resistant to the idea of biography. I had done a couple of Strachey type debunkings of people who I thought were overrated. But you're not really doing your job as a cultural critic in a celebrity culture if you don't do some of that Strachey type work. There are so many great tethered blimps just waiting for your attention. But I hadn't wanted to push it any further. I think this came out of probably some residual Marxism on my part. It was the feeling that in the telling of history, the role of the great man or great woman, the individual, is overrated at the expense of discussion of ideas or forces. When I was educated in England, it was, at least for the early years of it, it was a pageant of monarchs. We periodized our history by reigns. I don't think we stopped periodizing by reigns actually until probably the 30s. Then suddenly, if you notice, history is no longer periodized that way.
We still do it by administration.
Sometimes by administration, but sometimes by decades as well. America, I think, probably contributes a great deal to that form of periodization. At any rate, these were the resistances I had to overcome, and then maybe possibly some false modesty too. In other words, it seemed solipsistic to be writing in this way, and I didn't envy the life of people like Michael Holroyd for the opposite reason. It seemed to be too self-effacing. You were associated only with someone else's life. What are you going to do to have one of your own if you have to live the life of your subject all the time? So that was my frame and state of mind when Mr. Atlas, Louis Mem, approached me and said, would I like to do Margaret Thatcher? And I said yes. It did intrigue me as an idea. And I don't know how he knew this, but a few weeks later he called and said, you know, I don't think you're really happy with that, are you? And I realized I hadn't been thinking about it in the bath exactly, or in the shower, which is the unfailingly good sign for me when I have my first cigarette under the shower in the morning, to see if I'm still concentrating or not. And I said, no, as a matter of fact, no. And the only other time I'd ever been asked to consider a biography was by an agent who I think thought biography would give me a position in society of some kind, and had proposed Albert Einstein. And I knew at the first shower that that was wrong, because Hitchens on Einstein, it just doesn't compute. And if I thought it was ridiculous, I was fairly sure everybody else would. So then he said, well, what about Jefferson? And I realized in that instant that not only had I always wanted to write about Thomas Jefferson, but that a lot of the time I was doing so in any case, because anyone who makes America their subject is in a sense condemned. Maybe that's too bleak a word, but is at any rate destined to write or think about Thomas Jefferson part of the time. And all political conversation, to some extent, involves him. And while I live in a city that's partly his memorial, I've lived here for nearly a quarter of a century. I now know we have the same birthday, though he was born under the old calendar, had to change his birthday during the course of his life. We share it with Seamus Heaney and Orlando Letelier, among others. And then I realized that James had wanted this terse biography, and I thought how wonderful that would be. I forget of what book it is that Dr. Johnson says no man could possibly wish it longer. It may be Gibbon. But that with Jefferson, I wished he'd asked me to take a little more space. And in fact, I even asked him if I might go to the upper limit and perhaps a fraction beyond, for this reason. Jefferson is in power more or less continuously once he goes to be minister in Paris, for 25 years, very nearly a solid quarter of a century at the top of the political tree. And that is after he has written the Declaration of Independence and been the governor of Virginia and composed the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. So it's an extraordinary life in every way, and it's a very, very massive one. And he kept an enormous correspondence going, and he wrote a number of journals and memoirs. And I don't think now it would be possible for any one person to say that they had read everything by him and about him. I think it might be beyond the compass of an individual to have done that. But it's worth a try, and it's a huge education in what is already the great subject. That's the United States. I know I've spoken fractionally too long already, but I'll trespass a little more if I may. The project of the Enlightenment, which was part of his design and part of his declaration, was what influenced him the most. It comes out all the time, not just in the substituting happiness for property in the Declaration, but also in the paradoxes of his attitude to his own property, and in his wanting to be remembered only. He designed, as you may know, his own memorial, and it's the one that is at Charlottesville, and he wanted to be remembered only for the authorship of the Declaration, the authorship of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, and the founding of the University of Virginia. That's all he wanted.
Right, never mentioned
to be president twice, and vice president, and secretary of state, and governor and minister wasn't, he thought, that much worthy of notice. And even when he designed the Lewis and Clark expedition, and to some extent even the Louisiana Purchase, he was thinking of nation building, certainly, but he was thinking of building a new kind of nation that was based on a secular and scientific approach to life and to humanity. And one of the things that interests me most is his utter contempt for all forms of religious faith, which is a contempt that I personally share. And that's probably never been more germane than at the present. The idea of whether the United States is or is not a secular country. The other problem is too many forerunners. I mean, the Dumas Malone biography, which is the quarry from which the trucks still rumble away with chunks of stones. In my book, I actually say, I wish I could do to it what Jefferson did to the Bible, namely take a razor blade and cut out all the superfluous junk and see what we're left with. The Malone book is in a way a disgrace, and someone needs to far outdo me and do a replay. Merrill Peterson's Rivalry is worth mentioning, I think, here. Very good, shorter but solid book. And then, just because everybody asks about Sally, I've never met anyone and told them about the project who hasn't asked me about this. I should simply say that I do not see why there's ever been any controversy about this at all. I do not see how anyone could look at that evidence and be in the smallest doubt that Jefferson was the father of those children. long before the DNA tests were made, long before even Annette Gordon-Reed's brilliant book, it's staring you in the face. And so it was fascinating for me to find that many people vastly senior to myself and much more qualified could have examined that evidence and either concluded that it didn't point in that way or that it was ambivalent. And so I've done a chapter just on that, as I felt I had to do. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but my subject it just lived a lot longer.
And I think
the editor of Forbes FYI called me up and said, "What are you doing with the next month of your time? Would you like to do this?" And I said, "In a minute."
Would you like to have done that?
No, I would not. I'm really disappointed. So I was thinking I might get a Colin Powell free TV program. And this would be one of the benefits of him finally having deigned to tell us that he's not going to run. I was so relieved. I actually won some money on it too. I thought also now not every conversation that I have will be poisoned by speculation about this complete non-entity. I mean, non-entity in the sense that Richard describes him as having no ideas and no convictions, and I would add no principles, but not unfortunately non-entity in his record. I mean, he was able to play an undignified part in the war in Vietnam and helping to cover up the My Lai massacre. He was able to play a disgraceful role in the invasion of Panama. He lied directly to Congress about his role in the Iran-Contra scandal, and I'd like to think that he decided to bow out because he would have finally had to answer these questions if he'd run. But a merciful press made sure that he was never asked them while he was dithering.
Next
week.
I know.
I only noticed it this morning. I couldn't believe it was the only paper I was seeing it in.
Well, it
appears to be an element in the separation between, if you can have her separation from Mr. Turner.
It came from here. It's an old story. Let's say what's today is the 14th. It started on January the 6th on a .com, a worldnetdaily.com. Joseph Farrow was responsible for the story. And the story in the Washington Times basically parrots what he said. And it says, Fonda becomes born-again Christian, and she goes to the church, among other things, of her chauffeur down in Atlanta.
Yes.
And what would you like to... Are you a Christian?
I'm not.
What are you?
I'm not a member of any church. I don't think that there's any supernatural guidance. And
here's the article, by the way.
I don't think my presence here is attributable to any form of divine intervention.
What did you make of the story?
I thought it was a sad little story.
Why?
Well, someone who's getting a bit old and a bit silly and perhaps lacking for attention, and who I would have thought it would have been content with being born once, which is all that, in fact, she's ever going to be. Or any of us are. We're only going to be born once. So all this born-again stuff just gets me down, gives me a pain.
Says in this article, I'm extremely impressed with the genuineness and the sincerity in her search for spirituality and wholeness. The Reverend Gerald Durley, pastor of the Providence Missionary Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Miss Fonda has attended services, told the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, I think she's found a certain sense of peace among people who found peace with Christianity.
So hard to object to, isn't it? You know what I think what I don't like, well, there's a lot of it I don't like, as well as finding it totally intellectually and morally unconvincing, is that this is the form that they believe modesty should take. It's going around all the time about how you've found God and how God has a special purpose for you. And this is construed as humility. It seems to me the height of immodesty to say that you've been chosen in this way or selected, or that you could possibly know that you had been. It's arrogant and conceited and egotistic.
Waterville, New York, on the Democratic.
The other thing to say is that the stakes, as you both mentioned, both my predecessor speakers mentioned, are quite high. Polluting the world of language is a threat to democracy, a very direct one, and you can very often tell it by the sinister intentions of those who want to promote what the French used to call the langue du bois, the wooden tongue. There's a fully expressed intention of lying, if not obfuscating, flat-out lying when this happens. Claude Cockburn, a heroic figure of British radical journalism, needed to live as long as he did to make up for the time he spent in the Communist Party in the 1930s working on the Daily Worker, where he was one day idly scanning a communique they planned to reprint from Moscow, instructing the party on how to proceed, where he came across the sentence, actually not the sentence, the imperative injunction that the leading organs of the party must penetrate the backward parts of the proletariat. And when he said, when he said to the comrades, look, I'm not sure this is going to fly in Doncaster, Glasgow and other places where they sing, he said, no, but it's from Moscow, we've got to print it. And George Orwell, who I was glad you mentioned, was very vigilant about this in his work on politics in the English language and thought there was a real relationship, important, intimate relationship between language, truth, and logic. And you can notice when people have completely decoupled language from its meaning, and it's often to do with mixture of metaphor, so that again from Prague to Rotas you would hear the jackboot has been thrown into the melting pot. The fascist octopus has sung its swan song. And things of this kind, where it was perfectly clear that it was just quacking now, barking. And that's the origin of Newspeak. I'm going to come back to Newspeak. I'm going to end on it if I'm allowed to get that far. W.H. Auden made the same intuitive connection in 1968 when the armies of the Warsaw Pact occupied Czechoslovakia. He wrote a very short poem from just across the border in Kirksteffen in Austria because he saw the propaganda that had been used to justify this atrocity. It's a provocation against the existence of the Czechoslovak regime was a provocation against the Soviet Union. Those who thought otherwise were banging the drum for the Cold War. All of these terrible long Dubai expressions. And he wrote a short poem. It's called August 1968, and it goes like this. The ogre does what ogres can. Deeds quite impossible for man. But one prize is beyond his reach. The ogre cannot master speech. About a subjugated plain, amid the terrorized and the slain, the ogre stalks with hands on hips, while drivel gushes from his lips. It was the perfect encapsulation of the langue du bois and its relationship to aggression and totalitarianism. And it's it's better than an irony of history, it's a real vindication. That only 21 years later, the Czechoslovak people freed themselves from this regime without anyone losing even a fingernail, without a shot being fired, in a movement led by poets and dramatists and essayists and ironists who simply by folding their arms and mocking the system made it go away like the Kingdom of Oz. This is the high stakes that we play for. This is why it is funny, but it's also very serious. Now, before I finish, because I know I'm the one who's sitting actually between you and the panel, I think there are some other things we ought to be very strongly aware of. The worst is euphemism, I suppose. Again, Orwell was very tight on this and very hard. Euphemism, in other words, the invention of pretty words for nasty things. Sometimes we win a round or two here. I don't think any politician would any longer describe civilian casualties as collateral damage. They used to. I don't think they would dare to do that now. I think we won that one. But what is currently annoying me the most is the use of the word abuse to describe the rape and torture and molestation of underage children. It's not abuse. Abuse is what I do to Johnny Walker Black Label. It's a victimless crime to some extent. Looking for an easy and excusing word for rape and torture and molestation of children is itself a crime, and actually abets the crime, and makes it seem as if there's no case to answer except that of sin and repentance instead of what is really necessary now, which is law and, most important word of all, justice. So let's have no more of that. And let's have our press stop using this crummy word to describe this terrible situation. I think that the reporting of poll data as if it was news, newspapers, when they can't be bothered to research anything or do any work, commission an opinion poll and then report its findings as if it was front-page news already by itself. That's bad. And it leads to crummy expressions like approval rating. Why do we allow a word like approval rating to circulate? I remember seeing a poll in the Los Angeles Times at the moment when Ronald Reagan had, you may remember this, a cancerous polyp in his bottom. Up his ass, to be exact. I mean, let's not be... Well, The readers of the Los Angeles Times were invited to, in an opinion poll, to say, did they think that this polyp would A, be safely surgically removed, B, would come back, or C, would go into remission. So everyone was consulted as if they were experts on the state of affairs in the president's rear end. This is stupid, and the poll data language of consensus that goes with it, I think, is very stupid too. And it's a substitute for news. It's a substitute for research, for reporting, for analysis. It's junk and needs to be denounced as such. The word radical to me is a precious word. It has a very honorable history in the Romantic movement of the 19th century and in many movements associated with it. I think it's worth preserving. I don't want to hear that the scrofulous cleric Mr. al-Laki in Yemen is a radical cleric when he's talking about a return to the Middle Ages, doing without the services and talents of all women, talking about the torture and killing of homosexuals and the random infliction of violence on civilians. He should be called the reactionary cleric al-Laki, not the radical one. It robs the language of a word if we carry on in this way. The word community pisses me off. Who isn't in a community now? It's particularly bad in my adopted country and in my hometown of Washington, D.C. There's the defense community, all right, if you must. The intelligence community for the CIA is an outrage. The donor community for those who seek to influence politics by giving money under the table is appalling. And the ultimate reductio ad absurdum of it, I did actually once read in a very guardedly written account of organized crime, the Sicilian business community. You hear the word community, keep your hand on your wallet. Tragedy is another word that I think one cannot function without, and is a word of which the language must not be robbed. There are two definitions of tragedy. One is the Hegelian one. I think this is the most acute. The tragedy is when two rights come into conflict, when there's an apparently irreconcilable combat between two rights. That's a tragic situation. And there's the Greek one, the Sophoclean, the Euripidean one of tragedy being the fatal flaw in a great person, the one that will undo him, that will set his purposes at naught. These are important considerations. They're morally important, and they're dramatically important. They're aesthetically important. Tragedy is not when disco-going princess has a traffic accident. That's not tragedy. It may be an unhappy business, but it's not tragedy. And the use of vicarious identification, in other words, wearing green ribbons about people or yellow ones, but people we don't know, a waste of feeling, a waste of emotion on vicarious identification, is another sickly, euphemistic seduction into which the media continually lure us. Well, I've got some other examples too, but we'll save all that for the time when it's your turn. I just would close with Orwell as well. If you finish 1984, when you finished it, you'll find that there's an appendix by the author. It's called A Dictionary of Newspeak. It's only a few pages, but the idea of Newspeak is to make certain thoughts unutterable, especially any thoughts of freedom. So there will be no word for it. So it isn't that certain thoughts or opinions would be banned, is that they could not in language, in English, be formulated. And for a counterexample, Orwell cites a sentence that couldn't be rendered into Newspeak, for which there could be no Newspeak translation. And it goes like this: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain inalienable rights, and so on. Well, long may that remain untranslatable into any langue du bois, and let us all strive to stand by not just the language, but the freedom, the democracy, the aspiration, the beauty, and the dignity to which we are entitled as a birthright. Thank you.
We move on. Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Go ahead, please.
Hi there. Thank you for C-SPAN. Why, I'm calling to address Mr. Hitchens there. Mr. Hitchens, you sound like you are not a citizen of this country. Are you a citizen of the United States?
No, I'm not.
You're not. Well, Mr. Hitchens, I don't like the way you are conducting your questions and your answers to us.
Into each life some rain must fall, ma'am.
I am very, are you a socialist?
Yes, I just said I was.
Yes, well, I am a conservative, and I am totally opposite where you're coming from.
Yes, that's evident.
And I just wish that you would think about what you're saying before you say it.
Well, I promise to try. How's that?
When you were addressing the sailors on the ship, and you were emphatic about the way that they were mocking our president,
Mm-hmm.
I hope that you can really prove everything that you're trying to tell us.
All right,
Yes,
thank you.
if you write to me, Cara, for this, I'll send you the proof of that, by all means. Yeah.
I don't think there.
This guarantee, by the way, applies to all questions and all of my answers.
But I don't think you can guarantee. I don't think that there was wide-scale mocking of Bill Clinton when he went on the aircraft carrier Roosevelt at all.
Well, I have more than one witness to it, but I thought I'd direct the lady in question, if she doesn't, in case she doesn't want to write to me, or anyone else who doesn't want to go to that trouble, to look up Barton Gellman's report on the front page of the Washington Post. I can tell you the date. It was the Saturday before the great blizzard that buried Washington. I can date it by that.
Okay, but that's your evidence.
It quoted the captain. It quoted several of the officers and men by name, and they've made no effort to deny it.
In saying that they were very uncomfortable with his leadership.
No. If I held the commissions that those guys held, and it had been reported of me that I'd taken this view about the elected commander-in-chief, I would want to be in a position to deny it, and they haven't tried to.
Okay, but what do you mean by wide-scale mocking? And I didn't get.
Well,
that
I'll tell you
idea
exactly.
at all.
I mean, in the captain appealed over the tannoy because Marine snipers were holding marriage ceremonies on the deck and mincing up and down, and so as the helicopter was about to land, people were stepping out of rank and making obscene remarks about the First Lady and the President and the First Lady's daughter. The captain, who's named, appealed over the tannoy and said, well, okay, maybe we didn't vote for him, but I think we ought to show respect and so on, with what was described as a pleading tone in his voice. This is disgraceful. Okay, these guys live on off public funds. There is a tradition of civilian control, which means that it doesn't matter whether you agree with the policy or not. The commander-in-chief is a civilian and will be obeyed. And that's always enjoyed, I think quite correctly, overwhelming public support, no matter whether people like the policy or not, ever since Truman dealt with MacArthur. What I thought was much, much worse than all of this was the reaction of Aspin and Clinton. They acted as if they should be excused for being elected. I think it was an absolutely devastating report.
Okay, let me address this.
I can't give it enough currency, and I thought it was unusually good judgment of the Post, which I think is too often avoids controversy, to put it on the front page and feature it and say this kind of thing didn't used to happen under Reagan and Bush. It's a clear politicized indiscipline in the armed forces.
Well, I would make the point, Christopher, that Reagan and Bush merited more respect from the military than Bill Clinton. So let's not start
say that doesn't require a comment from me.
Okay, then don't give a comment if you don't have a comment. Number two is, so I think they merited more. I think they had more respect for the military. I think they had more appreciation with the military and what the military has done for this country and what the military is doing now for this country. And there's not the kind of disparaging attitude that Clinton has shown over the years.
Reagan for giving the arms to Iran that took American hostages, I suppose, is what you mean.
It had nothing to do with the
and Bush for arming Saddam Hussein. These are the things that merit the respect, right?
I don't believe it's true at all.
You don't?
But are you going to let me finish or not?
No, I'm going to keep harassing you while you defend Reagan and Bush. Why not?
Well, because I showed respect to you and let you finish your points.
Okay, you give, I'll take.
I don't know what you mean.
Give and take.
Okay, but let me finish then.
Okay, come on, don't be so sorry for yourself.
All right.
I mean,
my
if you can't stand a little heckling, we shouldn't be on discussion.
All right, why don't you go on?
I'm not sure everyone listening got the reference to El Mozote that the questioner included. That's a terrible massacre of civilians conducted by the armed forces of El Salvador in the early 1980s, which was known about but lied about by the United States government and by the U.S. Embassy in San Salvador, and has since been discovered in the form of mass graves and so forth, both to have taken place and to have been covered up, along with a very large number of other atrocities committed by soldiers who were under the direct arming, training and payment of American advisors. To me, it isn't really the dollar value of that matters anymore. I think it was appalling to spend nearly $500 million a year on the El Salvador armed forces. But given that the war is now over, and given the relative size of the contending parties, it seems to me really terrible that there isn't a proper war crimes inquiry going on in the United States as to who was responsible and who knew and who covered up and who lied to Congress about the certification of human rights progress in El Salvador for those years, when high officials were in a position to know of kidnapping, torture, and murder of everyone from the Archbishop of San Salvador down. I think there should be a war crimes trial.
Our next
Thoughts
call
on that and where our society stands today with regards to race relations and civil rights
Well,
issues?
it seems to me that when you look especially at college campuses, you get away from King's tremendous and very healing and very forward-looking emphasis on integration, more towards the black-insisted segregation once more. And this is black dorms, this is black studies programs that shouldn't have whites, this is black cultural centers, this is all kinds of institutions on campuses, state-supported, for blacks that whites are really not supposed to go to. Now, you think to yourself, if you believe in King's message of integration, which I do, and just racial equality, and getting away from emphasis on skin color, then you think to yourself, would this be allowed if the name black was changed to white? Would it be a white dormitory allowed at these universities, a white cultural center? And the answer would be no. It would be outrageous. I mean, not anybody in the world would ever entertain something like that. And so I'm very disturbed at the growing segregation insisted by black on campuses in particular.
I was agreeing with you up until that equivalence, because it seems to me that some of what you say may hold for campuses, but I mean the fact what is what's called ex-urban flight to the suburbs, but people deciding to have a whites-only existence and more or less to call it that. I mean, in fact, in many of these new suburban towns in places like Simi Valley, California, and so forth, people have to more or less sign a paper saying that they'll keep it all white. In other words, the phenomenon of whites saying whites only is not a new one. And the areas which are blacks only are not chosen by blacks as the places where they live. The moral equivalence of these elements of segregation doesn't seem to me to hold at all, which is why the message of King is still so relevant. What I would agree but more with Ken Edelman is that I think the recent Malcolm X fad has given a lot of people the impression that Malcolm X, proud, black, unbreakable, militant, and Martin Luther King, rather weak, conciliatory, lovey-dovey type. It's not the way I remember it at all. It seems to me that Dr. King, by taking on a whole number of important issues of power and justice, and daring, even while he was in a life-and-death struggle, and really was life-and-death struggle over segregation, daring to say that the society couldn't both do justice to its citizens and fight an unjust war in Asia, and to take the heat that came from making that connection, and to take the physical risk that was required from, as we now know, the official political police of the country, is an exemplary record of courage, and one that doesn't make it seem fair to me at all to think of him as a sort of milquetoast moderate.
Next up is Manassas.
It might surprise you to hear. I mean, I'm an atheist. That it distresses me that I'm going to have to teach the Bible to my son and my daughter, because the schools aren't going to teach the Bible even as a literary matter. They're not going to teach it even as a book. there's such a failure of nerve, and there's such a failure of, I mean to say not a failure, an unwillingness to offend anybody, which I think is a very boring way of educating children. The fact is, if you haven't read the Bible and you don't understand it, among others, you won't be able to read Shakespeare or Milton or Dante later on. You won't get the allusions, you won't get the references. So it seems to me that while education ought to be secular and church and state ought to be separated, and I believe churches also should pay taxes, that there is a danger of having a bland educational system that doesn't realize that religion is one of the great subjects of study. And I think that's a compromise that one could make with people who are devout believers.
We have just 5 minutes
West
left.
Hyattsville, Maryland, on the Democratic line. You're on with Christopher Hitchens.
Hi, I wanted to say how much I admire your writing skill and your willingness to come forward to speak about these hard issues. But the question I had was, would you comment on how and why the Kissinger and his co-workers could perpetrate such a deception or fraud knowingly for so long about the war, the Vietnam War?
About the Vietnam War?
Yes.
Well, it took a long time for the documents to come out. It does in this culture in Washington. People have to develop a conscience and testify. Some documents remain under seal for a very long time. For example, Mr. Kissinger and I had a dispute recently, which I think I won. In the letters column of the New York Times book review, I'd been reviewing Anthony Summers's book, very excellent new study of the Nixon years. Mr. Summers, in his book, has only just now got the files that show that, and the transcripts, the photographic record of the transcripts of the FBI's bugging of the Nixon campaign, which was ordered by President Johnson in 1968 because they suspected that the Nixon team was making illegal contact with a foreign government to try and subvert the Paris negotiations. And the Logan Act, to give you a bit of a fill-in, makes that a very illegal thing for an American to do, as well as obviously a very wicked thing for a presidential candidate to be doing in the middle of a war and a negotiation and an election. Anyway, though the Johnson people don't like to admit it, they did bug the Nixon campaign, and they did find that that contact was going on. There was illegal and unauthorized contact, and Summers has the transcripts. Now, but that's... I've always thought that would be found out, but I only now can say I've looked at the proof of it in the last 3-4 months. So that's why it takes so long.
Are there other war criminals?
And you see, if you don't have evidence like that and you talk the way I'm talking, I can tell you what happens. You get accused of being a conspiracy theorist, of being a paranoid, and so on. And you have to be extremely meticulous. But we can now say that that attentat, that sort of internal coup d'etat in the United States, did take place.
Are there other war criminals, in your opinion, besides Henry Kissinger, in regard to the Vietnam War?
Well, you make me sound as if I'm the judge of all this, and in a sort of Solonic position.
But I mean, in your sense,
yes, I mean, the difference being this: people like Robert McNamara, William Colby, who wrote Honorable Men, the Bundy brothers, and so on, who were architects of that war and did know of terrible things and did conceal their knowledge of them from the public, have tried to make an atonement. I mean, I don't know whether Robert McNamara would call himself a war criminal, but he certainly feels he has a very bad conscience about what he did and also about what he said.
What about Lyndon Johnson?
And there's every evidence that Mr. Johnson went to his grave extremely oppressed by the thought of what he'd done and how many people had died as a result. The difference in the case of Henry Kissinger is this. No, he's the only one of the people who had any part in really keeping that war going, and extending it and deepening it and running it intimately, and knowing very, very well indeed of how many people were being slaughtered, who's never made the smallest act of contrition. He's never attempted the tiniest bit of accounting or accountability, and only shows any indignation, even any pulse of emotion of any sort, when his own reputation is impugned, as it now has been.
Lakeland, Florida, Republican.
The ironic remarks that you can make at the expense of the one-party, two-party system, one-party state, two-party system, often come at the expense of United We Stand America, Mr. Perot's organization, because if you looked at their convention, as I did last week, what you saw was its total effect, namely, to get every leading political figure in the country, save the president himself, down there, and all to sound exactly the same. So the effect of the supposed third-party pressure was to make the two parties seem even more similar than they already are. And the same people, you talk to Perot people, you get this all the time, the same people who say we need a third party also keep saying that it's time the two parties buried their differences, rolled up their sleeves, became bipartisan, and got on with the job of cleaning up the country. They don't even realize they're contradicting themselves. I think it would be very good to have a new party, and I think that would make it the second party if it was ever to emerge.
Yeah, the first party is just the gimme party. I mean, that's both parties. It's just the gimme party.
Perot is a complete product of the system, of the Washington interface between business lobbyists and government, and that's where he comes from. I can't believe that anyone who really cares about political pluralism and honest debate could be influenced by such an obvious fraud and crackpot to begin with.
Phil Bennett.
You notice who they did finally applaud, those Perot delegates of the fashion parade, the cattle call of speakers. It was Pat Buchanan. That's the one who got them ready to put their hands together, make the rafters ring, and applaud. Now, Pat Buchanan is the perfect Washingtonian. He's the complete insider. He's really. He's a member of the Nixon gang, for example. He was a member of the Oliver North gang. He's been, I think, in government service of one kind or another for a greater part of his life. Absolutely an establishment type, despite a lot of conservative rhetoric. If people think that's populism, they are simply fooling themselves.
Well, first, let me just
That's
say,
absolutely the mixture as before.
Let me get a call in after
Nixon was
this
not a
comment.
gang. It was a group of extremely hardworking, devoted civil servants, a very tiny percentage of whom were, by a very strict standard, never applied before or since, prosecuted. But to call them a gang is really outrageous.
Listen to the tapes of that man talking to his associates in the Oval Office, and you are listening to a wiretap of a mob boss.
Christopher, I have listened to, I suspect, a great many more of them than you have, since it was part of my job to listen to them and to write about them when I was a speechwriter for President Nixon. This was a guy who used rough language. Whether it was rougher than Harry Truman's language, I very much doubt. The gifts that he gave this country while being crucified by hostile media, the gifts of a generation of peace, are really unique. And to describe him as a gang leader and comparable in any way with Ollie North is just
I agree with
wildly
Oliver Wendell Holmes, who says that innocent people do not accept pardons or ask for them.
Let me get a call in.
Well, he's wrong. You're wrong. Wouldn't you accept a pardon if you were?
Not if I was innocent, certainly
if you'd been
innocent
sent,
people do not take pardons.
If you
or solicit them as part of the price of their resignation. He should have either stood trial.
No.
Or
no, he was the victim of a lynch mob. You don't stand trial.
What lynch mob?
The lynch mob of the media and the Democratic Congress.
He was caught red-handed.
No, he was caught red-handed doing the kind of thing.
Straight to the joint.
Well, I was going to say, I meant to say something about Pat Buchanan. There are many things Pat says that I find somewhat extreme and puzzling, but he is personally the most likable and incredibly nice guy imaginable, and it's hard for me to square all the anger and hatred of him that I see, not from Christopher, who has a good-humored and moderate approach to everything, but from a lot of people. To him, he is just really the salt of the earth and an incredibly nice guy. I wish that somehow the decency of the man could come out a little more than it does.
Well, I mean, that could be left up to him, couldn't it? I mean, if you don't want to attract dislike, it's an old motto, I think. You shouldn't radiate it. Pat Buchanan radiates hostility, and his speech at the last Republican convention can't have fled your memory that fast.
We were on the same platform talking about it over at Comedy Central, and I was a little surprised by it, but what I'm saying is I wish Pat would let his essential decency and fineness as a person come out a little more.
I mean, we weren't the first network to think
The
of
man
pairing
who
the two
says,
of
the man who proudly says he was brought up in a home where the heroes were General Franco,
I know,
Joseph
I know,
McCarthy,
I know,
Cardinal Spellman, and I think Father Coughlin. Now this is
no,
this is
I don't
flirting.
think he said Father
Well,
Coughlin.
at any rate, that's a flirtation with fascism, and I'm afraid you have to call it by its right name.
I know. Well, I don't know
And
what to say.
working people who are deluded by this, but I think they found a friend, but just because he's against NAFTA and occasionally will attack the fat cats, should realize that that's a con.
If it's so incredibly clear to you that the religion is a hoax and a fraud, why are so many people in America deeply religious? Are they just stupider than you?
Well, again, I'll take your question in reverse order, if I may. Yes, I think I am smarter than most people in the United States. And the polls find that most people agree with that proposition. And only stupid people answer opinion poll questions. Second, I actually have not said that religion is a hoax or a fraud. There are fraudulent elements to it, as there has always been, the sale of indulgences, the promise of the miracle cures, and so forth, the offer of false consolation. But I describe it in my book, God is Not Great, available at fine bookstores everywhere. And I bring the work of great, I bring the work of great philosophers and scientists in my more recent anthology, the Portable Atheist, the anthology of writings of unbelief, to bear, to say that no, it is the oldest argument that our species takes part in. And it's the reason why I'm fascinated by it, interested in it, willing to conduct it, never refuse a challenge to do so. Religion was our first try at cognition. It was our first try at epistemology. It was our first try at philosophy. It was in some ways our first try at mathematics. It's what we came up with because we are pattern-seeking and ambitious and freedom-seeking mammals when we didn't know we lived on a round or spherical planet. We didn't know that we were in circulation around other heavenly bodies. We didn't know about gravity. We didn't know there were microorganisms stronger than ourselves that explained a lot. We didn't know why the heavens darkened and rained or hailed. We didn't know why there were earthquakes or floods. It was the first tremulous attempt to make sense. And in the work of Aquinas and Augustine and elsewhere, we see the first glimmerings of our attempts at philosophy. And in the Cranmer Prayer Book and the King James version of the Bible that happen to be my favorites, and the English hymnal, we also have the beginnings of a literature. The first time everyone who could read had all read one book and had a common discourse. So it's, for me, a very, very important and honorable, and at its best even a noble subject. But of course it is man-made and a delusion. And it is used by wicked people to exploit the credulousness of innocent people, to create not an eternal life or life of freedom in another world, but a real, actual, material, secular dictatorship now claimed by people who have the arrogance to say that they themselves are acting in the name of God. And that's why it has to be opposed. Now, I can do the rest very quickly. It's called the ontological argument. It says that if you can name the idea of a God, surely there must be something existent or real, at any rate, that you are talking about. It's not the teapot that Bertrand Russell postulates orbiting the sun. To talk about it is to postulate it. Well, this, of course, is a piece of circular reasoning, but I hope I helped to clarify it in my opening statement by saying there's every difference between being a deist and a theist. Science and reason cannot disprove the existence of a first cause or a creator. They cannot do that. We can only say that everything works without that assumption, and there is no evidence on the other side of the case. This seems to us to license unbelief. To the theistic argument of a God who actually is interested in answering prayers, cares who you marry, who you go to bed with, what you eat, which side wins in a war, and so forth, we say this is human propaganda, self-evidently man-made, and the so-called miraculous evidence for it has been repeatedly and conclusively falsified and disproved.
I'm not sure whether these are really questions or just things I'd appreciate if you could comment upon. One is why religion should be worse than other ideologies. For instance, you mentioned Stalin. Aren't people in power always going to find some ideology of some sort to use in order to justify their exploitation of others? And then the second part is the consolation of religion. You talked about it being an illusion and so forth, but the friends that I have who are believers, and this is something that's always amazed me, do seem to find true consolation in religion, and I see them experience life events, terrible deaths, accidents, horrific things, and manage to survive them with a huge amount of fortitude and energy, where a lot of other people fall apart. And what are you going to replace that kind of belief with to help people?
Well, to answer your question in reverse again, it's just the way my mind works. William James says in The Varieties of Religious Experience that these things are true to the people who believe them, but they are subjective. They can't make it true for you. So if I was to lose a child and someone was to come up to me and say, well, she's in a better place now, you know what? It wouldn't cheer me up. It would make me very sick and very angry if anyone tried that on me. But if they want to try it on themselves, that's absolutely fine. But don't let them have it taught in any school by public money. Don't let them have it taught to my children. Don't let them have it read out at the opening of Congress. Nothing like that. If it works for you, fine. But I don't want to hear about it.
Keep it private.
And by the way, my experience has been somewhat different from yours. I have found that it's precisely at moments of bereavement and disaster and so on that many people find out how utterly hollow and banal and disappointing and second-rate and man-made religious services really are. But that's a subjective impression too, so I can't claim any authority for it. As to the difference between secular and theocratic dictatorships, I don't think there is one. I think all serious totalitarian dictatorships are theocratic. And George Orwell was right in pointing that out. It is not the case that fascism and Nazism were secular by any means. Just to start with that, I mean, if you take the history of the 1920s and 30s, any decent modern history of that period, and you cut out the word fascism or fascist, and you insert the word Catholic right-wing, you don't have to change a thing. Whether it's Portugal or Spain or Croatia or Poland or Hungary, these are right-wing extremist parties in political alliance with the Vatican. In some cases, like Slovakia, the actual leader, the head of the state, Father Tiso, is an ordained minister. In all cases, the cement of the regime is the Catholic Church. That's what fascism is. It's just been reconfirmed by this moon-faced Bavarian peasant Ratzinger, who can't wait to get these people back in the show. And it was confirmed after the war in South America, when every single fascist regime, after fascism had been defeated in Europe, was endorsed by the Vatican, and every wanted Nazi in Europe was found under Vatican protection in Argentina. And believe it, it's a story anyone can read. This is not secularism. National Socialism in Germany, I shouldn't go on about this too much, but it is a very crucial question, is slightly different. Like Mussolini, Hitler's first treaty is with the Vatican. It's the very first treaty he makes and sticks to. In exchange for the Catholic Centre Party being dissolved, he gives the German Church, Catholic Church, complete control over education. That's what they wanted, that's what they got. Not a bad bargain. They have in common, of course, anti-communism and anti-Semitism already. By an order of the Vatican, Hitler's birthday is celebrated from the pulpit of every church every year till 1945. This is not my image of a secular political system. And they, by the way, they've never denied this. We've never exactly apologized for it either. Nazism does contain some pagan elements, some Nordic, cultic, Valkyrie worshipping, Odin fancying, garbage of that sort too. But that's not secularism either. So, I mean, I just resent and reject the entire idea that this is the case. Now, with communism, can I take a minute? Because it's I know this question's got to come up. And I do have it in my book, available at fine bookstores everywhere. At a very reasonable price. And I'll sign anyone who'll give me a receipt for it. Could a fairer offer be made, I ask you, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters? In Russia, until 1917, for several hundred years, several hundreds of years, the peasantry has been taught that the Tsar is a person slightly higher than a human and slightly less than a god. He's the head of the church as well as the head of the state. He's called the Little Father, the Holy Father, so forth. Serfdom is all based on this idea of there being a supervising, semi-divine authority. If you are Joseph Stalin, and you've already been in a seminary, and you're not smart enough to take advantage of this huge reservoir of servility and credulity, then you shouldn't be in the dictatorship business to begin with. It's there waiting for you. People are already trained. They've been lashed and chained into this kind of obedience. They're already wondering who's going to be the new Tsar. Well, what happens? There's an inquisition, for one thing, the show trials. There's miraculous harvests. 3 harvests a year with new grains that have never been seen before, so everyone will eat as they've never had. Miracles are proclaimed. It is said that everything comes from the Divine One, from the head, from the one who must be worshipped and thanked at all times. All blessings proceed from him, as do all punishments. in case any heresies should be found out, which they regularly are. What is this? Is this a secular society? In no way is it a secular society. Does the Russian Orthodox Church desert? It does not. The Russian Orthodox Church then, as now, counted Stalin as one of its saints. Now it's even more flagrant. They're printing these icons of him. But then they carried on side the entire time. He was very careful to always maintain a state church, and because it always had been a state church, a state patriot church, the same applies. So I rest my case. The original form of totalitarianism is theocracy. You will never find a really totalitarian system that isn't religious. Okay, do I really mean that? Yes. Apartheid. Apartheid is the doctrine of the Dutch Reformed Church of South Africa, that black and white people are different species. That's the definition of apartheid. It's not racism. It's not a civil rights question. It's a theocratic decision. We have the right to rule. It was given to us in the Bible. The others are the sons of Ham. They toil. They do the hewing of wood and the drawing of water. That's apartheid. It's a completely religious thing. The theocracy in Iran is based entirely, well, you know, it's on the Velayat du Faqih, a very violent reading of the Shia Gospels, and so on and so forth. It's not for those of us who defend the... Have I run out this? I knew this would happen. In order, in other words, for the critique, it's not really a critique, for the cheap objection, like I get everywhere I go, well, what about secular? I don't mean that your question was cheap. I mean, it's sometimes asked in a cheap way, an opportunist way. In order for there to be a fair test on a level playing field, you'd have to say, right, once there was a society that stopped paying taxes to any churches, that stopped opening its parliamentary meetings with prayers, that wouldn't let God be taught to children in the schools, that taught people instead the work of Lucretius about the origin of the natural order, and Galileo, and Spinoza, and Darwin, and Jefferson, and Paine, and Voltaire. Once there was a country that tried all this, and then it fell into slavery, famine, show trials, and I don't think that will be found to have occurred. I don't think it would occur if that's what we all did. That's what it would take to make a fair comparison. And that's what, it's because they know that that's true, that the people who don't want it to be true suggest this false analogy instead.